Welcome. Oh, we are recording the lecture. For the Q&A, however, just to let you know, we were going to stop recording so we can have a nice open conversation. I'm Linda Kuhn. I'm Dean of the Honors College. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight colleague and friend, Dr. Timothy Landry, who's currently teaching in the Anthropology department at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He did spend a year here brilliantly teaching for the University of Arkansas in the fields of religious studies, African art history, African and African American studies. So we feel like we're kin group to Professor Landry. And for the students out there, excitingly for the January intercession, Dr. Landry will be offering a signature seminar that centers around the subject of tonight, witchcraft, in very interesting interdisciplinary ways. So I think we're going to go ahead and put up in the chat the link to where you can read about Professor Landry's signature seminar, the full title of which is much more complicated than witchcraft. It also deals with magic and with occultism, esotericism, global witches, and even goes backwards to the ancient world. I think we're going to start in ancient Greek culture. We sort of interrogate the works of Aristotle and Plato, all the way up to contemporary esotericism. So this is going to be an amazing opportunity. I see that Katie has put the link to the actual class. You do have to apply to get a seat. Applications are up until October 30th, 11:59 p.m. And again, the class is during the January intercession. You won't regret it. I don't care if you're in engineering, STEM, agriculture, I don't care. This is a chance of a lifetime. So let me tell you a little bit more about Dr. Landry before I turn it over to him. And I'm also going to give you the rules of engagement for tonight. Dr. Landry earned his PhD at the University of Illinois, an outstanding place to do religious studies, the anthropology of religion, and African studies. He also has spent time in West Africa and in Haiti. And his first book, which I happen to own a copy proudly, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in the year 2019. And it is entitled Voodoo, Secrecy and the Search for Divine Power. Highly recommend. In fact, Dr. Landry just got back from 6 months in West Africa. He was in Benin, where he was doing field work for a second book that is going to basically tackle some of the issues he's going to be teaching in this January intercession. So I think our students are in a great position to be in the process of making a book. Right? We're hoping that Arkansas Honors College ends up in the acknowledgements, right? But before I turn the stage over to the amazing Dr. Landry, who also won the Clifford Gertz Prize in the Anthropology of Religion, anthropologists out there, that's a big deal. The rules of engagement are for tonight, we're going to put everybody on mute, not because we don't love you and we don't want to hear from you, but because background noise gets, as you all know by now, super disturbing, especially to the lecturer. We will then, when we go to the Q&A session, Dr. Landry is going to talk for about 40 minutes, and he is willing to entertain your questions also during lecture. Put them in the chat, and we have two awesome Honors College ambassadors, and that's Stephanie Beidel and Sarah Long. They will be monitoring the chat, and they can stop and pose questions during lecture. During the Q&A, you can volunteer to come on screen if you would like, but you can also put your questions in the chat, and our Honors College ambassadors will be vetting them for you. All right, that's enough of Linda Kuhn. Let's turn it over to the expert, Dr. Tim Landry.
Hello, everybody. It's really fun to be here because I got my career started at the University of Arkansas, and it's you know, the University of Arkansas always feels like a second home to me. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm really excited to come back in January and teach a class about a topic that has intrigued me since my childhood. maybe it'll help if I frame kind of my interest in the occult a bit, and we can then start talking about magic and thinking about that in the context of the class and in the context of perhaps even current events going on right now. I grew up in Houston, Texas, but in a New Orleanian family. My family was from Southern Louisiana, the New Orleans area. So voodoo was always kind of like part of my own cultural zeitgeist. And I just remember, you know, as a kid reading books about voodoo and reading books about Louisiana folk tales and charms and those sorts of things piqued my interest in magic. And of course, I grew up Catholic. So if you're Catholic, you're just one step away from being a witch anyway, because Catholics are really good at magic, right? So that was always part of my practice, I think, kind of my own personal religious practice at the time as a kid, growing up Catholic. And that just led me to studying witchcraft and the occult, both as an anthropologist and, you know, as someone kind of interested in the hidden layers of the cosmos and the hidden layers of the universe. And I started doing work on it. My first research project was on spirit possession in Haiti. And then I moved to West Africa and started doing work with practitioners of voodoo. And as Dean Kuhn mentioned, that I was just in West Africa working on a project on sorcery, West African sorcery, and the effect of objects and things. I was really captivated by the use of animal parts in rituals. And maybe this is a good time for a story, since I'm an anthropologist and I like stories. I was in Benin for the first time in 2006, and I was at this market, a sorcerer's market called Bohime, that in English, people often translate it to fetish market. And these fetish markets are huge markets, perhaps the size, some of them the size of football fields and larger, that are selling things that people use to do magic and sorcery. And those things include herbs and plants. They also include dried animal parts. And those are the kind of rare items that people go to these markets to buy. And I was just looking, I was exploring. I didn't even really know where I was at, or my first time in the country. And this little, a young teenage boy, maybe 13, 14 years old, comes up to me and he's holding this basket. And over the basket is a brightly colored cloth. If you've ever seen African cloth, you know what I'm talking about, this beautiful kind of cacophony of color on the cloth. And he lifts up the cloth, and inside this basket are dozens of dried chimpanzee hands. You see those dried hands and you think of the endangered chimpanzees that they were once attached to, and you think of wildlife conservation, you think about wildlife ecology and things like this. And he says to me, he goes, do you want to buy some? Do you want to buy these? They're really good at grabbing wealth. And we got to talking. I didn't buy any chimpanzee hands, obviously. It would have been incredibly unethical, but we were talking about the chimpanzee hands a lot. And at the end of the conversation, he said to me, you can't deny what the hands want to do. And that comment always struck me, because he said it as if the hands had a say in this, and as if the hands themselves had agency and had will and were in some ways interlocutors with the sorcerer, that they were part of the project, part of the sorcerer's project. And that's really the ethnographic moment that inspired me to travel to West Africa and to understand sorcery and the connections of magic and sorcery and witchcraft to objects and things. And the project that I'm working on now is called Willful Things, because I'm thinking about the ideas of how objects have their own agency. These could be animal parts, for example, the chimpanzee hands who grab wealth. You might find pangolin scales. If you know what a pangolin is an incredibly endangered animal that has looks very similar to an armadillo, that has scales, like armored scales all over its body. Those scales are used in magic to render people bulletproof, because they have this kind of symbolic protective armor. You might find lion skins and things like that used to bestow power and strength, leopard pelts in particular, to bestow strength and power to their users. So all of this sort of thing became really interesting to me. And I decided that I was going to go back to Benin and work on a project particularly focused on magic. And I don't really know what to call it. I mean, I'm sure some of you will ask me, what words do we use? Do we use magic? Do we use witchcraft? Do we use sorcery? And I don't think I want to get into the nitty gritty of those definitions, although we certainly will in the class. I think part of the class is going to be thinking about these terms and thinking about what they mean and making a feeble attempt at defining words that perhaps are somewhat undefinable. I'm going to, in this talk today, I'm just going to use them interchangeably and rather lazily, if you don't mind, because I think the minutiae of the differences aren't that important to the scope of what we're doing here today. But I went to West Africa to start studying magic. And the first thing that, when I teach classes, the first thing students always ask me is, do you believe in this? Do you believe in magic? Do you believe in witchcraft? And, I don't think belief is the right word to frame our understandings of these sorts of magical systems. And first of all, there's no word for belief in the West African language that I work in, so they don't even speak about this in contexts of belief. But I have seen things, right? I've seen things happen that are unexplainable. One time when I was out doing work, it was in the rainy season, and somebody was suggesting that they wanted to get married in the rainy season, and I was talking to them about the rain, and I was like, it's really raining quite a bit here. I don't know if you want to get married in the rainy season. I'm going to hire a sorcerer. It's fine. He's going to stop the rain. And he hired a sorcerer. The sorcerer came and did his thing, and the rain stopped just in time for the wedding. And the wedding went on, and after the wedding, the rain came back, right? So I don't know if that makes one believe in magic, but it certainly makes one opens oneself up to the possibility of believing in these sorts of things. Perhaps one of the most profound acts of magic that I saw in West Africa involved bulletproofing. And I was in a village. This is actually before I was working on this project with magic. It was one of the things that inspired this project. I was in a village with a friend, and I was actually there not doing work. We were just there, although if you're an anthropologist, I suppose you're always doing work. But I was there because my friend his family was having an ancestral ritual, and I was just there as a guest of the family. And they were doing a ritual for the ancestors, and there was this old man there who had charms, just kind of tied all to his body, and you could see just amulets and talismans and charms kind of dripping off of him. And my friend walked up to him. My friend he was also very interested in sorcery, and he collected sorceress knowledge. And he went up to this guy, and he asked him, what's the most powerful charm you have? And the guy said, I have the ability to make you bulletproof. And my friend's eyebrow peaked, and he was very keenly interested in this charm. And they negotiated a price of 50,000 CFA, which is about $100. And my friend paid him. And then we went to the market and collected all the things that he needed to make this charm. And he brought all those ingredients back, and we gave them to the old man the next day. This was after the rituals were over. And the old man took all the ingredients and went into his house, and he did some things and added some things. We don't know what he did, actually, because he wouldn't let us watch. It was very secretive. That's the thing about these sorts of rituals, is there's often masks of secrecy that protect the knowledge, right? The sorceress knowledge. And he comes out with this little bitty bundle, no larger than a strawberry, right? A very small little bundle. And he hands it to my friend, and my friend says, I want to see it work. If I'm going to pay you money for this, I want to see that the power of this charm works. And I'm thinking, this is a bulletproof charm. I'm curious to see how they're going to prove that this thing works. So the old man sends off for some chickens, or a chicken, I should say. And one of his sons comes back with a chicken, and the old man's friend comes, who's a hunter. And the hunter starts loading his black powder rifle This is when, having been raised in Texas comes in handy. I was watching very closely and watching him load that rifle, making sure that he was loading it properly. And he took the rifle and he shot it at a tree, and you could see, you know, the leaves shred in front of your eyes, attesting to the efficacy of the rifle. And then he took the chicken and he tied the charm to the chicken, and he tied the chicken to the tree. And then he went back and he loaded that rifle again, and I very closely and very carefully watched him again. And then he took that rifle and he shot the chicken, or shot at the chicken, I should say, because all the leaves around the chicken shredded as, you know, as the shrapnel, because it was a kind of like a buckshot, you know, it wasn't a single bullet, it was like a shotgun shrapnel inside the black powder. All the leaves around the chicken shredded, and the chicken squawked a bit. But I went up to the chicken and we cut it out of the tree, and I looked for blood. I looked with earnest for blood on that chicken, and I found nothing. The chicken was alive, and the bulletproofing charm seemingly worked. So when people ask me, do I believe in magic? I don't really know what I believe in. I don't know if believe's the right word, but I've certainly seen things work. There are different ways that I think anthropologists can approach magic and approach witchcraft and sorcery and these sorts of occult powers. And I think the history of magic and anthropology is a messy one. It's quite honestly, it's rooted in racism, right? It's rooted in these kind of old schools of what anthropologists would consider evolutionary models, where you think about, well, why, you know, the early anthropologists were asking questions like, why can you have Europe developed European countries and underdeveloped African countries in the same time? You know, these are very racist questions, basically asking why is it that Europe is more evolved than Africa? So they had these really problematic racist unilineal evolutionary questions that were being asked. And one of those questions that piqued people's interest was the evolution of religion, and people speculated that magic was proto-religion, perhaps magic comes before religion. So I think it's important to remove magic, first of all, from these evolutionary models. But I don't want to throw out the word completely. I think some anthropologists do. I think there's certainly arguments for throwing out the word magic completely, because it invokes these early models that were very clearly racist and targeted Africans and Native Americans in particular, and Aboriginals. So it's good to, I think, unhinge the concept of magic from these particular categories. But I think throwing out the word magic completely doesn't really do us much service, because there are things in the world that are best described through the lens of magic. And whether we're talking about collecting chimpanzee hands to acquire wealth, or we're talking about taking a statue of St. Jude and throwing it in your back seat and driving around the streets of Chicago screaming at the statue while St. Jude has to do things for you. I mean, those are all forms of magic, right? So from my perspective, and my perspective of magic, and one of the things that I hope to help students come to in this class that I'll be teaching in January, is that we should be expanding the way we think about magic, right? And I'm sure there's people who are listening to me talk right now who are maybe not happy that I'm thinking about prayer and ritual transubstantiation in the Catholic Church, or saint veneration as forms of magic. But I think it helps to expand the concepts of magic instead of restricting them, because I think for far too long, we think of things that we do as religion, and we think of things that other people do as magic, that magic is the religion of the other in some ways. And I think we have to do work to dismantle that, because we all participate in magical thinking. From people like Tim Tebow, who's very known to be quite religious, right? Putting his eye black on and writing biblical verses in his eye black before he plays. That's magic. Praying to saints for intercession, bathing yourself in holy waters and holy oils and going to Our Lady of Lourdes and bathing in healing waters. That's all magic, right? But because we do it, we don't contextualize it that way. And I think that one of the things that I hope to do in this class is to disrupt those boundaries and disrupt those borders and really dismantle what magic is and what magic isn't, so we can expand the term. Because frankly, I mean, I have a personal reason for doing this. I want to live in an enchanted world. I don't want to live in a world void of magic and void of enchantment. You know, when you're a kid and you go to Disney World, one of the things you love about Disney World is the perception of magic all around you. And I think magic uplifts us. It's symbolically potent. It helps us control the uncontrollable. I think as human beings, we do so well with uncertainty. I mean, with misfortune, I should say. And we, of course, we do well with good news too, but we do really badly with uncertainty and things that seem out of our control. But magic gives us the ability to control those things, right? Magic, even if only psychologically, gives us the ability to control the uncontrollable and helps us to calm our social anxieties about things that we may be experiencing. So for me, living in a world that is enchanted by magic is, it's compelling, it's interesting, it adds light, it adds spice to life, right? It is in some ways a kind of electricity that binds life together, is this sense of magic and the magical worlds that we live in. As a matter of fact, I wanted to call the class Enchanted Worlds, but I'm not sure I would have many people signing up for a class called Enchanted Worlds. But in some ways, that's what we'll be talking about, right? The ways in which magic enchants our worlds. And Dean Kuhn was saying in the introduction that people who are STEM should take this class. And yes, you should, because magic and religion, or esotericism and science, have been in bed together for a very long time. I mean, they've been connected since the beginning. I mean, it really wasn't until much later that esoteric thought became separated from science. And I think it's interesting to kind of think about the ways in which magic, religion, and science are all essentially in the same business, right? They're all in the business of knowledge creation. And it's important to remember that early scientists and early philosophers were also occultists, right? And what does it mean to be an occultist? That may be a good place to start if we're thinking about these things, right? The word occult just means hidden. And I think there are people who were very interested in understanding the inner workings of the universe, the inner workings of the cosmos, right? Now, we have physicists and we have scientists who do that too, and they do provide a good look under the engine, as it were, of the cosmos, of the universe. But there are other ways of doing those things too, and you know, really up until perhaps, you know, the medieval period, you see people who were thinking of magic and science as all part of the same worldview, the same, collecting the same data, doing the same things. Where you have scientists who were actively participating in alchemy, or who were astrologers, right? These are people who were doing both of these sorts of things, but they were people who were looking to understand the inner workings of the cosmos, to looking to understand apparent discrepancies in the Torah or in the Bible. And because of that, you see, and one of the things I think surprises students when they study Western occultism or esotericism is how much Christianity and how much Judaism in particular is in the occult, right? Because there are many different pillars that hold the occult up, but one of them is Jewish mysticism. And as a result, we'll be learning about Jewish mysticism in the class and thinking about how Kabbalah in particular affects or has inspired the occult, and how early Jewish and Muslim mystics and thinkers who were essentially early occultists, and people like Saint Francis of Assisi could be identified as an occultist, right? People who are trying to really understand the hidden mysteries of the cosmos. And that's what we're going to be doing in this class. Now, I'm afraid I'm really sad to tell you that we will not be able to understand the hidden mysteries of the cosmos, because that is what the occultists call the great work, right? And we will be doing part of that. We'll be doing the great work a little bit, trying to understand how other people saw the cosmos and how those things shaped Western culture, how they shaped the way we see the world, how they shaped our interactions with other people, how they currently continue to shape the world that we live in. And these things are pertinent completely in today's world. I mean, I think people think of magic and they're like, why are you talking about magic? Why are you thinking about magic? This is 2020. We should be thinking about science. Yeah, we should think about science, but there's plenty of room to think about the role of magic and witchcraft and sorcery and all these things too, because all you have to do is follow contemporary politics and see what happens and see how people are mobilizing magic. And let's talk a little bit about that, because I think it's kind of an interesting frame. Because I should say that one of the theoretical perspectives that I take, both in my work and in this class, is that of a feminist approach. So the first frame that I push my analysis through is a feminist one, right? And I think that if you're going to be in this class, you can expect a very rigid, strong kind of feminist perspective. And what I mean by that is that when we hear the word witch, you don't think of Dumbledore or Gandalf, right? You think of the Wicked Witch of the West, you think of the Wicked Witch of the East, you think of Samantha, you think of maybe even Sabrina. You think of women, right? And the word witch has been used against women since we can remember, right? It's definitely a word that has been over time used to malign women. So we'll be using that particular approach in this class and thinking about how do we think about the image of the witch and what is a witch, and how do we frame the types of people who we consider to be witches, right? Why is it that when we think of female magic users, we think of the Wicked Witch of the West? When we think of male magic users, we think of powerful wizards like Gandalf or Dumbledore, right? Why is there this gender discrepancy? Well, it's about controlling women. It's about controlling women's power. It's about, early on, it was about controlling midwives. I'm thinking about women who were herbalists and healers and midwives for people. Those early midwives became witches, right? They became, when the church wanted to decentralize power out of women's hands, they did so by demonizing women's work and women's skills. And that still goes on today. And, we think about, I remember the day, boy, do I ever, the day that Donald Trump was elected. And the day after, if you're on any of the witchcraft forums in the country, in the United States, was a very interesting day, because you had witches all over the country calling to hex Donald Trump. And there was in particular, there was occult run stores in all over the country. Definitely a very famous one in Brooklyn, who was setting up rituals, and people were coming in and they were actively performing rituals to hex Donald Trump. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg got sick, witches mobilized to try to do magic to heal her. And when she passed away, the call to hex Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump came up again, right? So people started talking about utilizing occult power to hex politicians, right? Politicians who were objectively oppressing women and objectively oppressing LGBT people. And this is very common, right? When you have oppressed people using occult magic and occult powers to really speak truth to power, or to actively operate and work against oppressive agents. So that's what you have going on right now, and it's really interesting. I'm teaching a class right now on this here at Trinity, and one of the things that's really interesting right now for the students is to see the amount of just kind of talk that's happening on the internet in particular about mobilizing to do magic to help Joe Biden win the election or to hurt Donald Trump. Of course, when Donald Trump got COVID, you can imagine what the witches were saying the day after that, right? There was a big kind of celebration that the magic was working, that he in fact was infected by COVID. So you see witches utilizing these occult powers that they have to work against the oppressor, right? The person who they perceive as the oppressor. That has always happened, right? People have always done these sorts of things. People have always utilized things like ritual or magic or sorcery to push up against people who are hurting them or oppressive. And that's, I think, one of the really interesting things about magic, at least today. Now, in the contemporary, so what we'll be focusing on a lot in the class is we will, as Dean Kuhn said, start with Greece and kind of start with I like to start with the Eleusinian mysteries, although I assume you could start even before that. But thinking of how ancient Greek rituals and ancient Greek and Egyptian interactions and long historical interactions have influenced Western occultism, how those kinds of early interactions gave rise to secret societies within Europe, societies like the Golden Dawn or the Ordo Templi Orientis, who were both influenced by Freemasonry. So we'll be talking about Freemasonry too, and thinking about how Freemasonry has affected the rise of these traditions. But the real heart of what we'll be looking at is a religion that started in the southern UK in roughly in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And that's a religion that some of you may have heard of called Wicca. So Wicca was started by a man named Gerald Gardner. Well, Gerald Gardner gets credit for starting it. I think it's far more complicated than saying that Gerald Gardner started this religion. But it's a religion that started in a very particular moment in history. Gerald was allegedly initiated in the late 1930s into a coven of witches in an area of the UK called the New Forest. When he was initiated into that coven, there was a lot of things going on at that time. People were talking about a particular hypothesis, for example, that there was an anthropologist named Margaret Murray who had this hypothesis that suggested that there were actually covens of witches who were still practicing witchcraft in Europe, but in secret, who hid from the Inquisition and were still practicing these old pagan religions. Gerald was there when he moved to the New Forest area. Excuse me. There was an order, a Masonic order in the area that he joined, and there was a group of people in that particular temple who all believed themselves to be reincarnated witches, because reincarnation was really big. It was really important on the kind of cultural landscape at the time, especially in the occult world. People talked a lot about reincarnation. And they all believed themselves to be reincarnated witches. And they started a coven. And they were all Masons. They were co-Masons. So it was a Masonic lodge that both men and women were allowed to be part of. And so it's no surprise that you see a lot of Masonic influence in Wicca today as a result of that kind of early Masonic influence in the first coven. But there was also just a lot of information being traded amongst people in that area at the time with Jewish mysticism in particular. So you see a lot of Kabbalah influence in these early religions, in this early religion in Wicca. You see paganism, like veneration of the earth, but you also see a shift from attention to a all-powerful male deity to a shift to a central female deity, where the divine feminine becomes the central focus of worship. And that's the religion we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about, because this religion becomes incredibly interesting. Because in 1963, that particular religion comes to the United States by a man named Raymond Buckland. Raymond Buckland was a British man working for British Airways, but he lived on Long Island. And he traveled to the UK after reading a book that Gerald Gardner published called Witchcraft Today, to be initiated. He traveled to the Isle of Man, as far as we can tell, and was initiated by a woman named Monique Wilson. He spent a couple weeks with Monique. Monique was one of Gerald Gardner's early initiates, and he learned the craft. He learned how to do the ceremonies. He learned how to perform their rituals. He learned about their secrets and their mysteries. Then he came back to the United States, and he initiated his wife, and he and his wife started a coven together on Long Island. So the first Wiccan coven to come to the United States started on Long Island. Now, at the same time in 1963, what was happening on the West Coast? On the West Coast, you had a rise in environmentalism, you had a rise in feminism. All these things were becoming incredibly important. And frankly, geography just prevented, I think, the East Coast and the West Coast from coming together in that regard, right? So you start seeing a rise in eclectic, what I would call eclectic paganism in the United States, female central goddess-focused religions coming out of California in particular. These goddess-focused religions on the West Coast, which are much more eclectic in nature, much more kind of feminist in nature, and less connected, I think, to these Western occult traditions that I was just talking about. But then on the East Coast, in the New York area, you had again, a goddess-central religion where the goddess is the most important deity, and you then had some minor sense of environmentalism, but most of this was focused on kind of feminism and feminist religion, the centralization of goddess worship on Long Island. At that point, once that coven started taking off on Long Island, and you had the high priest and the high priestess, Ray and his wife Rosemary, divorced. That changed the landscape of witchcraft in the United States forever at that point. And what happened at that point was they then turned the coven over to someone else, and that person started running the coven. And the coven actually isn't running anymore, but has hundreds of covens that are descended from that coven in the United States today. It is interesting to note, though, that Gerald Gardner's coven in the UK is to this day still running. He's long dead, but the coven is to this day still running. So that coven's been running since the late 1920s. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Really running until the 1940s, I should say, because there was that moment where he was kind of building the coven. So you have today in the United States, you have strong traditions of Wicca. And because of the stuff that was happening on the West Coast, you have what I would consider a more eclectic branch of Wicca, and what I mean by that is Wicca that's not bound by tradition, that's not bound by the rules of tradition, that they kind of take what they want to do and take from here and take from there and borrow from all kinds of places, and with a rough kind of concept of a similar spirit of Wicca. So Wicca, as I've already said, is a religion that was born out of the kind of crucible that was happening in the southern UK at that time. It's a religion that centralizes the goddess, the Lady of the Moon. She's a lunar goddess. So full moons become incredibly important to them. And a lord of death and resurrection. And this god, the image of the god, has horns, and he has these kind of big antlers. And because of that, people often connect him to Satan, but they don't believe in Satan. It's a false equivalency. Just because something looks like something doesn't mean it is the thing, right? But certainly Christians have done a lot to suggest that they're actually worshiping Satan, despite the fact that Satan isn't part of their particular worldview. As I've kind of already alluded to, full moons are sacred to them. They do magic on the nights of the full moon. But they also have 8 holy days that map out on the calendar. And those are the 2 equinoxes, the 2 solstices, and the midpoints between them. So the 2 equinoxes, the 2 solstices, and the midpoints between them. And we actually have one of those midpoints coming up very soon, Halloween. Halloween is a holiday, and maybe I'll spend a little bit of time talking about Halloween since it's approaching. Halloween is a holiday that most pagans today call Samhain, pronounced Samhain, but spelled S-A-M-H-A-I-N. It's an Irish word, or Samhain. And this holiday is what they would consider the third harvest. So these rituals that they're doing are based on an agricultural calendar, right? So the two harvests that they just had before this were wheat harvest and fruit harvest. And the harvest that they're about to have is their final pre-winter harvest, right? But it's not what you think, it's a slaughter. They're about to slaughter their animals because ancient people would bring livestock inside their homes to prepare for winter. And the animals that couldn't fit in the home, they would slaughter, and they would then preserve that meat to get them through the winter, right? So so these are the kind of holy days that people who practice Wicca are adhering to. These are days that are designed to put them in sync with the rhythm of the earth. So very pagan, right? So I've always said that Wicca is really deeply informed by two major streams of thought. One stream being European paganism, built on the equinoxes and solstices and the midpoints between them and full moons and the sacralization of the earth and the sacralization of women. By the way, this religion is matriarchal. The high priestess runs the coven. It's her coven. The high priest is only there to support her. She has final say. It's a completely matriarchal and goddess-focused religion. And on the other hand, they are deeply influenced by Western occultism, like some of these going all the way back to ancient Greece. So these really interesting kind of streams of thought that come into thinking about Wicca. But Wicca is has been one of the fastest growing religions in the US for quite some time. I guarantee you there are Wiccan covens in Arkansas. I know of a legitimate coven in Little Rock, for example. And I know there are other pagan groups in Fayetteville. There's even a witchcraft store in Fayetteville, right? So there's all kinds of stuff going on. You just don't know about it. Those things are under the radar unless I think you know really what you're looking at. So in this class, we'll be looking at all of these streams of thought, right? Looking at the Eleusinian mysteries, looking at the rise of secret societies, looking at the medieval period, looking at the Renaissance period, looking at how the medieval period and Renaissance period changed and how they changed the occult scene. We will look at how these things facilitated the rise in Masonic secret societies, societies that were kind of built off the Masons is what I'm suggesting, such as the Golden Dawn and other societies called like the OTO, for example, and how those then led into Wicca and spread to the United States, and how those things then collided with American environmentalism and American feminism, and then it produces what we have today, and how we see Wicca, or how Wicca is practiced today. So you have this complete trajectory of things, and I'm going to be looking both historically and anthropologically, looking at this timeline, but then really thinking about why are people doing this? And what is it about the lives that they live that facilitate or encourage them to seek out the occult? And I can speak personally, the things about the occult that intrigues me is I like the decentralization of patriarchy. I like the centralization of the divine feminine. That appeals to people, right? So that, as you can imagine, that appeals to women. It appears to LGBTQ people, right? The kind of decentralization of the patriarchy and the understanding that the patriarchy in its construction is toxic, right? And the kind of rejection of that toxicity and the use of magic to fight against that toxicity. Right? So thinking about that, thinking about class and how does class play into this? How does race play into this? How does all these other kind of social markers play into these things? And what is it that people are really searching for? What are they really looking for? How does somebody grow up Protestant, going to church every Sunday, and then end up summoning demons in their living room? And I don't mean demons in the Christian sense. I mean demons in the occult sense, right? In the sense that, we will be talking about in the class a particular set of rituals called the Goetia, where sorcerers actively try to physically summon demons. And what are they trying to do when they summon these demons? And why is that particular occult practice right now on the rise? Why are more and more occultists today interested in summoning these demons? Well, Aleister Crowley, who was a really famous occultist who we'll spend a lot of time talking about in the class, suggested that these demons that people are summoning are not actually physical demons of hell, but they're demons of our ego. They're demons that live inside us. They're demons of our psyche, right? So anybody who's interested in psychology, for example, or any psychology students would particularly love this class, because in some ways, I mean, Carl Jung was an occultist, right? He used tarot in his therapy a lot. And thinking about, if I have a demon, for example, that causes anxiety in my life, then I can identify what that demon is and I can summon it. I can summon that demon and trap it ritually, and I can banish it to the bowels of hell. And I can remove the demon's influence from my life by banishing. Now it sounds, when I tell you, oh, I'm going to summon a demon, that sounds really bad, right? But what they're doing is they're using the authority of God, of the God that you all are familiar with, the biblical God, because they draw the names of God in the Hebrew alphabet on the floor around them, and they circle themselves in names of God to protect themselves from these demonic influences. And then with the authority of God, they banish these demons. They banish them completely from their lives and are able to emerge from those rituals better, right? So when I present to you demon summoning in that particular way, I bet you think a little differently about it, right? You think, well, when you were talking about demon summoning, I was imagining someone summoning Beelzebub. Well, yes, they summon Beelzebub, but they're summoning Beelzebub with the intention to banish Beelzebub's influence in their life. So this is all kind of part of, I mean, if you're a psychologist, you might say this is part of it's therapy, it's therapeutic, right? And magic is therapeutic. Anthropologists have known that for a very long time, that magic is therapeutic, right? And these rituals are therapeutic. And I speculate that as the world becomes increasingly more uncertain, and as the world becomes increasingly more challenging, especially for women and queer people, that people increasingly turn to magic and witchcraft to fight against these oppressive agents of power, to give them control over these sorts of things, but also because they find tremendous meaning in it. Because at the end of the day, religion is about one thing. And I'm not, this isn't an original idea. It's about community. It's about the community that religions build. It's about the people who you practice with. It's about the connections that you make with other people. And the fact of the matter is that people are turning to witchcraft for those reasons, for a sense of community. I can't tell you how many people who I know today who practice witchcraft because they felt rejected by their families and they find empowerment in witchcraft. And I'm talking about LGBT people in particular, finding empowerment in witchcraft because they felt disempowered in their lives in other ways or by people around them. And witchcraft has taught them to be self-reliant, to use their kind of own power within themselves to set their life straight, right? The thing is that I think if many of you participated in a witchcraft ritual, you would find it rather mundane, and you would probably find it quite uplifting. Because I think when we think of witchcraft and we think of maybe even things like Satanism or demonic summoning, we have very particular images that come with those imaginations, right? Images that often malign women, that often malign the poor, that often malign people of color. And I think we have to reorient the way that we see those things and reorient the way that we see magic. If any of you have ever been to New York City, you know that there's a park in Brooklyn called Prospect Park. Prospect Park is an interesting place to look at when we're looking at magic and witchcraft, because Prospect Park has been a place that Afro-Caribbean people who live in New York City in particular have used as a ritual site. And there's always people in an uproar about people using that park as a ritual site, because they'll find like ritual paraphernalia left in the park and they'll classify it as litter and dirt, and they'll you see in the newspaper all the time people arguing about, oh, they're littering the park, right? Well, what they mean is they're not using the park in a white Protestant way, right? Is what they mean. And we have to think about, if these spaces are public and spaces are truly public, then what do we mean when people of color are using, what do we mean when we say people of color can't use these parks in the particular way that their religious traditions encourage them to use them, right? So that's another thing we'll be looking at in the class, is how when we think about witchcraft and sorcery, how are we framing those words around the oppressed, around people of color, around women, around the poor, around LGBT people? How are we thinking about witches in those particular ways? And why is it that when we think about witchcraft and we apply that particularly to white men, why then do you get powerful wizards? Right? Why are male magic users powerful wizards? And thinking about the intersections of gender and all those sorts of things in the construction of not just of actual practice of witchcraft, which we will spend time thinking about, but also the image of the witch, how we think of the witch, how we see the witch, how we see practitioners of witchcraft. And how can we expand that vision? How can we expand the idea of witchcraft so that we're not using the word witchcraft to malign people? Because let me assure you, the people who you are maligning over and over again with the misuse of that concept are people who are poor, who are disenfranchised in any number of ways, right? So why do we do that? And thinking about how we do that, and thinking about how we can reframe that. And by reframing that, we start getting at, I think, the kind of real symbolic value of witchcraft. And I think it goes down to community, and goes down to connections, and goes down to dealing with the uncertainties of life and being supported by community. Because that's one of the things we don't do very well in the United States. It's something that we've kind of lost culturally, and thinking about how people may mobilize witchcraft and the occult to do these sorts of things. But look, I think we're all occultists. And I think we have to think about it that way. Right? We all want to know the secrets of the universe. We all want to know what's under the hood. And at the end of the day, that's really all that occultists are doing, is they're really trying to understand the inner workings of the cosmos. And I'll leave you with a story. I was trying to understand this kind of concept of looking at secrets and understanding, well, what secrets are you really looking at? And this occultist, he said to me, he goes, well, how many people did God kill in the Bible? I was like, well, I don't know. He said, well, he flooded the earth, so all of them, except for one family. And then he asked me, how many people did Satan kill in the Bible? The answer to that is 0. And then he asked me, who's the bad guy? And that was an interesting question, right? And then he says, that's what I want to understand. I want to understand this. I want to understand how we think of God. And is God really the good guy? Or was Satan the good guy who wanted us to eat from the tree of knowledge, who wanted to remove us from the ignorance of the cosmos, who wanted to help us see how the inner workings of everything worked, and God forbade that. So Lucifer, the light bringer, brought light to the world and pissed off God. So there's all kinds of occult understandings of Genesis and occult understandings of interactions between God and Satan and demons and angels, and thinking about what is the real message of religion and what they see as the real message of religion, right? And how they see the cosmos and how the cosmos is working. So hopefully in this class, students will get a sense of not only the history of the occult and the history of why the occult came to be, how the occult came to be, but also just like, what are people trying to really get at, and how do people think about the occult in terms of understanding these great mysteries? And what do people get out of understanding those mysteries? And I don't think it's any different than any other quest for enlightenment or quest to enter into the kingdom of God, or whatever you want to say the goal of whatever religion is. It's all the same. But they believe that there are hidden mysteries in the cosmos that only careful study can gain access to. And those are the sorts of things I hope we'll go over in the class. So I could keep going. So I think I'm going to stop. That seems like a good place to stop. And I went a little over, but I think that's okay. But I'll open it up to questions. I'm sure some of you have some questions, and I'm happy to, have I seen the recent, I'm going to let people, I can't watch the chat room, so I'm going to let other people read to me what they would like me to answer.
All right, Dr. Landry, wow. If you ever had any doubts about the brilliance of the major of anthropology, I'll bring you Tim Landry. Wow, that was an amazing ride. And students, we're going to try to do this seminar face-to-face, unless some other strange event occurs in our lives. So I would like to call up the Honors College ambassadors, and that's Stephanie Beidel and Sarah Long. And they are going to monitor the chat